Sup, freaks? It's your boy Marty here to introduce this episode of Tales from the Crypt with the immense pleasure of sitting down with Edward Evenson from Slush Pool / Braiins to talk about mining pools, their profit strategies, how they're creating value-added services for miners, what the future of mining pools may look like, a little bit of wine, a little bit of cheese. Great time, great conversation, great follow-up to the conversation I had with Leo Zhang. So if you just listened to that podcast, this is a great follow-up to that, to add to that conversation. This conversation was brought to you by our good friends at the motherfucking Cash App. Cash App. Cash App. They're helping you stack sats, send sats, sell sats, receive sats, and sell sats if you so please. I think I said sell sats already, but we're saying sats because you can make sats a standard. We're no longer buying fractions of Bitcoin. We're stacking whole sats, and you can stack whole sats automatically. You can set it and forget it. You can buy daily, weekly, bi-weekly. You can DCA into sats via the Cash App. I almost said via the Bitcoin. Via the Cash App is allowing you to dollar cost average into Bitcoin. On top of this, they have Cash App investing, which allows you to stack slivers of stonks. If you are into that type of thing, you can purchase as little as $1 worth of a stonk that may be on your mind. You can stack a sliver of a stonk. And because all of this is connected to your bank account, there's no 4 to 5 day waiting periods. You can start investing today. Cash App may even be your bank account. They're offering account number and routing numbers to users so you can get your paychecks direct deposited into the app. You can be your new bank. You can leave all the old banks behind, all those old farts. Cash App can be your new bank. I should say that Cash App Investing is a subsidiary of Square, member SIPC. As always, make sure you use the code STACKINGSATS when you download the app. It's STACKINGSATS. You're going to get $10, and $10 is going to go to our good friends at Owls Lacrosse. That's Owls Lacrosse. Owls Lacrosse. Enjoy this episode.
You've had a dynamic where money's become freer than free.
If you talk about a Fed just gone nuts, all the central banks going nuts.
So it's all acting like safe haven.
I believe that in a world where central bankers are tripping over themselves to devalue their currency, Bitcoin wins. In the world of fiat currencies, Bitcoin is the victor.
I mean, that's part of the bull case for Bitcoin.
If you're not paying attention, you probably should be.
What is up, freaks? Welcome back to Tales from the Crypt. It's Marty Bent here. Looking forward to another deep dive into mining. I'm very excited for this particular conversation because I think it is actually going to be a great extension to the conversation I had with Leo Zhang, which you freaks should be able to listen to by this point in time. We're recording before that drop, but by the time this drops, that will have dropped as well. I'm sitting across from Edward Evenson from Slush Pool in Braiins. Edward, how you doing?
Doing great. Thanks for having me on the podcast. I've been a listener for a while, and it's good to finally get on here.
Well, you're putting me to shame with the studio you're sitting in right now. I'm looking through Zoom from a back deck. I've got construction to my left, so the mic's definitely picking that up to some extent. It's very cold out, and you are in a soundproof, warm studio, and you have the best audio quality of any guest I've ever had on Zoom, so I'm very jealous.
It's actually one of the first times we've used it. So we kind of put the sound padding and everything in the room, and then our logo up and purple lighting and all that, and then we promptly just stuck a bunch of miners in here, and so we can barely use it because there's already 4 to 5 miners constantly humming in here for testing some of our stuff. So I'm glad we could get to finally bust it out.
Testing in the podcast studio. You gotta make sure each room has multi-purpose to get as much bang for your buck in terms of rent. So,
well, it's the only soundproof room in the whole office, so people tend to put it in here. Otherwise, they get really annoyed if it's in one of the other rooms.
Yeah, I can imagine that gets annoying. That screaming, the cybernetic hornet noise is a very loud and annoying one if you're subjected to it for too long. Yeah, we got a lot to talk about today. We'll get to mining pools and firmware and stuff like that eventually. I just want to learn more about you, how you came. You've had a very interesting career up to this point, have traveled the world, it seems, from California, have lived in China. Where are your roots now? You're in the Czech Republic, but
yeah, I'm based in Prague.
yeah. So how did you, number one, find Bitcoin? Number two, specifically hone in on mining and working with Slush and Braiins?
So I guess I'll tackle the Bitcoin thing first. I first encountered Bitcoin just very casually and superficially. It was in, I think, like 2012 or something like that. I just overheard one of my friends speaking about it at university, and I didn't look into it, and I didn't know anything more about it besides the brief 5-minute conversation we had on it. And then some years later, right before I went to China, I was in a grad program studying economics and history, and I was particularly interested in the formation of early financial institutions and early political economies and how they evolved into what we have today. And I was studying the first illegal mint outside of England and the British Empire and what is now New England, like Boston area. And I thought it was really fascinating that this tiny colony started minting its own silver coins called pine tree shillings, and the resulting catastrophe that followed when the Crown in England found out about it, and it started sparking these debates over whether or not they had the right to make their own or mint their own coins or not, and whether the Crown should have a monopoly when it wasn't extending any help or providing any liquidity or like money supply to the colonies at the time. And so I just started getting really interested in topics like that. And
Whoa. Can we dive into that topic a little bit?
yeah, of course.
It's
Yeah.
infinitely fascinating. So what happened? They had the New England colony was minting silver coins. So they had a private banking system, essentially.
Yeah, so when specifically Massachusetts, right, like what is now New England was basically, in all but name, the colony of Massachusetts. They were the most powerful, they had the most leverage. Everything that is now Maine was Massachusetts as well. They were the most developed. And when they first got there, they didn't have really any actual specie, what it was called, like gold or silver coins. And so they had to do things like employ natives to trade wampum, these shells that were often harvested off the coast of Long Island Sound. But when the Dutch and English started doing that, they started sort of making like a factory business out of it. And so those inflated away almost instantly because the natives realized that the colonists really wanted this and can get stuff like copper and iron if they did trade with them. And so within a matter of a couple decades, wampum had inflated to basically being worthless. And then so they needed to find other solutions, and it was just really difficult facilitating any trade, paying debts, things like that. So eventually they employed a very prominent man from Boston by the name of John Hull, and he was a silver worker, silversmith. And they enlisted him, the town council, to basically set up the first Massachusetts mint. And this is really significant considering that at the time, this is like well into England's rise as the most powerful like superpower in the world at the time. They hadn't reached their peak yet, but still extremely, not to be messed with. And this was the only and first instance of a entity owned by the British Empire that started making its own money. And of course, you can imagine the consequences for doing so were automatically like the top tier, the worst things you could possibly get. It was considered treasonous. You'd be put to death. You'd be made an example of. So it was pretty risky undertaking this venture. And basically what happened is when it came to light in the late 1660s through 80s, a couple people that were responsible for it were sort of dragged before the Crown in Whitehall in England. And they were basically told to explain themselves, and they very cleverly put a pine tree on the back and said that it was actually the tree that housed Charles I when he was hiding during the English Civil War. And it just so happened that I think James II, who was one of his grandsons, was in power at the time. And they said it was an homage to the king, and through its symbolism, they paid homage to him, and they fairly like sent the king his tax, because you're supposed to give like a fifth of the specie to the crown, and they sent it to him in the form of timber for masts, which were only available in like the large trees that were found in North America at the time, because England was largely deforested by then, codfish, which is still prominent today in Western Europe. I mean, you can't find codfish in the waters around here, but it's still like a national dish in Portugal and Spain. Yeah, and eventually, somehow, I don't know how, they wiggled their way out of death sentences and public executions. They had to shut down the mint eventually, but it was a really interesting sort of contest and experiment and battle between the colonies and the crown, and whether or not the colonies were going to have control over their own money or not.
Yeah. It's a tale as old as time, the struggle for sovereign monies. That's a fascinating story. And the way to wiggle out with the pine tree on the back, and a 20% tariff to the crown.
Yeah, so because it was so risky back then, right? You had to like set up ships. It took months to get across the Atlantic. You needed to finance it somewhat yourself, et cetera, like exposure to disease, you name it, really risky venture. And people saw all the silver and gold that the Spaniards were getting out of the New World, particularly out of Potosi, this mountain that was basically had a massive silver mine underneath it. And, the other European powers wanted that for themselves. So they said, hey, if you go out and explore this new world, which is extremely risky, and, at your own peril, you get to keep 4/5 of whatever you find in terms of minerals and ore, but you have to give basically the king his cut. I can't remember the exact term they called it now, it's been years, but basically 20% of anything you found belonged to the crown.
It's crazy. It's crazy how like colonization and exploration led to these insane deals between colonists and the crown, and so the crown would mostly finance the travel across.
No, it was actually the colonies were originally set up as joint venture companies. So when you see the earliest references of like Virginia and Massachusetts, it wasn't as a colony or a state or a government, but as a company. And basically a bunch of middle class to somewhat wealthy men at that time would pull together funds to support the setup of these colonies in the hopes that the natural resources that they would gain from the setting up of these companies at the time would pay back, 100-fold.
It's fascinating. And here we are. I'm in New Jersey in a plastic house. So you're studying this stuff, and this naturally just pique your interest about Bitcoin, the fact that it is a apolitical way to create a money that is separate from any state.
Yeah, I mean, immediately, because I'd been studying stuff like I just described for years at the point I actually dove into Bitcoin. And it was just automatically fascinating to me, and its potential to sort of just completely make all these contests throughout time irrelevant surrounding money. And I just, in that regard, in a historical context, I immediately recognized the potential once I actually understood it, once I got beyond that, 5-minute superficial conversation I had had years before. And that's what really kind of made me dive down the rabbit hole. And then I got to Shanghai, China, started going to like local meetups. We just meet at bars or parks, a bunch of people that are local, whether they be Chinese or another expat, get together and talk about what they were doing, whether it be Bitcoin or crypto, like blockchain in general, Ether projects, mining. I had a bunch of different people there. And then this eventually led to getting into mining in a professional capacity. It was easily the most interesting part of the whole ecosystem to me. And then I moved to Beijing to start working in it with F2 Pool. And now I'm here at Braiins and Slush Pool in Prague 4 years later almost.
So what's your experience with the pool life been? This is an area, it's funny because mining, I would say until maybe more recently, is not getting the love that I think it deserves, particularly when it comes to pools. It's probably one of the most important. It's obviously one of the most important parts of the network. It's one of the major stakeholders and the thing that makes it go round. And there's been a lot of debates in the past of the distribution of hash power, particularly in pools, is centralized. But before we get to that discussion, like what's it like working at a pool? What's your job been at these pools up to this point?
Yeah, so I've been mostly on the business development and marketing, like growth side. And I can tell you, I guess my overall experience is the market changes extremely quickly. You always got to pay attention because the markets are 24/7. Something new is always happening, and it's fiercely competitive. Really fast paced, really fun. And yeah, I guess that's kind of like the short and dirty of it. But in terms of mining pools in general, I think we're well into this shift, but my long-term outlook on them is that they'll cease to exist as we've traditionally known them. I've been saying this for a while now, and it's clearly happening in many cases. So whereas before you'd have entities that would just solely be a mining pool, you can't really do that anymore. Like the race to the bottom in fees doesn't support that type of business model. There have been multiple mining pool companies that have publicly stated that they don't intend to turn a profit off their pool, and they're using it to leverage some other services they have, like looking at Huobi or Binance, the exchanges, trying to push off exchange services onto them, some derivatives, some loans, things like that. Or you have others offering financial services in tandem with the pool. And then you have us that offers firmware, soon management systems, the pool, another fun project that will be coming out 2021 that I can't really speak about. And yeah, so everyone's trying to expand vertically aggressively. And as larger entities like DCG and potentially legacy institutions get deeper into it, maybe like Fidelity or some other investment funds, the pools will change even further because they'll have to be completely auditable, compliant, and then there may even be a need for something like KYC, AML in them.
Ugh, I hate that. I hate the thought of that. The corporatization of pools does that. So let's dive into the dynamics of why the inherent nature of pools is changing. You alluded to it in the fact that profitability is being driven towards zero. But what is driving that specifically? And then let's get into a discussion of whether KYC AML compliance forced on pools sort of denigrates the sort of essential properties of Bitcoin from a permissionless standpoint.
Yeah, definitely. So the first point, I guess, would be that some of these larger companies with huge reserves of Bitcoin have, driven prices into the ground because, like I said before, they're not interested in really turning a profit on the pool, but just want to push some of their other products they can make money on, or some maybe, like I said before, loans or structured derivatives or exchange services, financial services. And so that's been a huge part of it. The fact that, most pools are pretty similar. So really the only thing they can offer as an advantage over the others purely on the pool side would be a reduction in fees. And yeah, so basically what this means is because pools in a large sense are kind of like providing insurance to the miners, right? You get a reduction of variance in exchange for a fee. However, traditionally within insurance companies stemming all the way back to the 16th century, in exchange for the insurance company taking on the risk, you pay an insurance premium. But because of the context and scenario I've just described, miners are getting quite comfortable not having to pay that premium. So it's not really a profitable business in and of itself anymore, and it's kind of turned into a loss-leading, project that, in an attempt to accumulate as much hash rate and as many miners in your network as possible so you can leverage them and their hash rates for other things in the future.
Yeah. Try to create moats of users that will then use more of your products. And it's interesting. It's crazy how quickly it's all evolving too. And I think obviously Slush is the oldest pool, been around for a while.
2010.
It has survived the test of time, and you guys have innovated on this. It seems like, obviously, we had Jan and Pavel on the podcast. It feels like almost 2 years ago now at this point, when we were talking about Stratum V2. But the firmware that you guys offer your customers has been on the market for a while. It's something that seems like Slush and Braiins really honed in on pretty early, and it is a great product that miners love. And so I guess we could jump into the firmware conversation. Like, how do you guys view offering that service particularly, and what benefit does it bring your customers?
Yeah, so the project started several years ago in reaction to some things we showed Bitmain was doing, I guess, to put it simply. And those two things primarily being ant bleed and covert ASIC boost. And just for a quick 20-second thing for those that don't know what those two things are, ant bleed was basically a backdoor which would allow Bitmain to essentially shut off people's machines or have the ability to. And covert ASIC boost was Bitmain running ASIC boost covertly on its machines and its own facilities without disclosing it sort of publicly or allowing their other customers to run it on their machines. So we were the first to offer overt ASIC boost through our open source Braiins OS, allowing people to get another like 13% efficiency out of mining. And then a bunch of people, of course, since we open sourced it, piled on board, and it's pretty much universal now. There's still some people that don't use ASIC boost, but I think it's only really NiceHash that does that, and it's because it's for a SHA-256 pool that mines all sorts of different coins, not just Bitcoin. But it's standard now for the most part. And then we started developing that primarily for S9s because that was by far the most used machine on the market at the time. And then eventually we added our own proprietary tuning algorithms to it, which essentially allows you to squeeze some more profitability out of your machines through overclocking or underclocking, and having some a tuner in there, which basically adjusts frequency and voltage to optimal settings given power consumption setting. So, anywhere from 15 to 25%, depending on the power consumption and machine you're running it on. We've since expanded to the S17, S17 Pro, S17 Plus coming out in a couple weeks, as well as the T17 models after that. And we already have people working full-time on WhatsMiner as well. So we're looking to expand the service throughout all Antminer and WhatsMiner models and allow people to run their machines maybe a couple more years, as people have been able to do with the S9s with tuning firmware, as well as increase the break-even price and give miners the ability to squeeze as much profitability out of their machines as possible, because the manufacturers do not allow you to do that with the stock firmware they give.
We know that well. When WhatsMiner? That's our question at Great American Mining. But before we get into more details with the firmware, so do you guys just split some of the increased revenue from those performance tunes? Is that how you profit out of that?
That's what really helps fund anyway some of the open source projects we do, like the open source versions of the firmware as well as Stratum v2. And basically what happens is we take a dev fee. It's different size depending on the generation of machines. For the older machines, it's a smaller dev fee, about 2%. And for the newer gen, we'll be charging 2.5% of the hash rate. But this is, well under the profit uplift that the miners experience. So they're generally much more happy to pay the dev fee than they are a mining pool fee, because they just see the mining pool fee as a cost they have to take on of running their operations, whereas the dev fee, they get some sort of efficiency boost or profit uplift that well exceeds the actual dev fee they have to pay, so they see it as a win.
Yeah. No, the firmware has always fascinated me. Like, why wouldn't the producer or the manufacturer just allow users to mess with? Because you basically have to jailbreak these machines, correct? And then tweak with the firmware. Like, why wouldn't manufacturers just deliver the best possible firmware, or deliver it so that users could tweak with it without having to jailbreak it? It's always been a question of mine. I mean, I think I know the answer, but I'd like to hear.
It's kind of bizarre, right? Because you purchase the machine, these very expensive machines, by the way, and you're supposed to own them at that point. But for some odd reason, the manufacturer will do its best to lock you out of the machine that you own. And when unless you're a massive miner, because they will unlock it if you're a huge customer in some cases. But if you aren't, then you're kind of screwed, because they won't let you into the machine even though you own it. And if they see that you've been sort of trying to get into it or installing some other firmware onto it that you want, it completely voids the warranty, which is completely fine if they want to void the warranty for that. But what I don't understand is why they don't do something like open sourcing their firmware. Because a lot of the reasons when they were asked, and when I personally asked them at conferences or just via email or something, it's that, we want to protect our clients and we don't want them to be exposed to viruses and things like that. But it seems sort of counterintuitive, because if something is open source, you'd be able to see exactly what's running on your machine, and you wouldn't have to worry about things like viruses or security breaches.
Or amp bleed.
Yeah, or stuff like Bitmain putting basically kill switches into their product, or seeing, making it easy to see if they are running something that allows them to mine more efficiently against their own and compete with their own client base. But of course I see some reasons. There are some reasons why you wouldn't, I guess, just offer tuning or certain features into your firmware as a manufacturer. Like standardization is really important. It's really important to be able to say, hey, this is the specs of the hardware we're selling you. This is what you can, like the minimum of what you can expect, plus or minus, 2 to 5%. And it's really important, especially when you're structuring multi-million-dollar deals, that people know what it is they're getting, and there isn't just a huge variance. Because when you do start doing stuff like under or overclocking or tuning, the performance of that is highly dependent on the quality of the chips inside the machines, often referred to as like the silicon lottery. It's always interesting, a little frustrating when miners keep wanting to know, like, what's the best power setting with your firmware, or what's the exact efficiency I can get out of the machine. It's like, well, it's completely dependent on the quality of the machine, how long it's been running, the environment it runs in. Is it immersion cooled? Is it air cooled? Are one of the hash boards dead? There's just so many variables that come into play that the best thing really is to just test it and see what each machine gets for you. But in the end, it's 9.9 times out of 10, it's definitely worth doing.
Yeah, I'd imagine the manufacturer probably, especially for smaller miners, just wants to lock them into a purchasing cycle, where if you're able to extend the lifetime of the individual machines, you're just buying miners less often.
Think of the iPhone batteries and how shitty they've gotten over the last years. Just oh wow, my iPhone batteries only last like a year now. Right when the next model comes out. That's interesting.
Planned obsolescence. We're trying to get away from it. Okay, all of you miner manufacturers out there, but it is fascinating, and it adds to the, I guess, excitement of this industry, is having to jailbreak these machines and tweak them and geek out as much efficiency as you can. Eke out, excuse me, not geek out, but you can geek out over it as well. So like how much of your business is driven by working on this firmware specifically? And obviously Stratum V2's been a topic of conversation, something you guys have been working on as well. I'd like to get an update on that, and potentially ways in which you guys are going to expand your product offering. I know you hinted at something in 2021 we probably can't talk about, but other things outside of the firmware to help your profitability at Braiins and Slush.
Yeah, definitely. So on the first question, there's been a huge push by me to shift as much of the revenue over to the firmware, because one, it's more sticky. As I said before, miners are much more happy to pay it because of the profit uplift they experience from it, and also the previous things I had to say about mining pools and where I see them headed. And it's been going really well so far. For the first, 6 or 7 months of its existence, it was only S9s, but that took off really well, partly because of the incentives we offered on the pool if you used it in conjunction with Slush Pool. And then more recently, in the last month, we started releasing some of the S17 models as like a beta version, and the full release is coming out very soon. And that's showing some good progress so far. And we even kind of upped the ante on the deal, where if you do use Braiins OS Plus on your machines, you have 0% pool fees. just to add some nice little juicy incentives for people interested. And yeah, so it's driving more and more of our revenue actually as each month goes by, which was the goal. So I'm very happy about that. And then for your second topic of V2, V2 is actually supported now, and it's also supported through Braiins OS if you run it on your machines. On the open source version and the plus version, especially on the open source version, you get some pretty insane like data load transfer reductions, like 2 to 3 times smaller. It has a lot of the security features of preventing middleman attacks and people from potentially stealing your hash rate. And then we actually have a grant through Square Crypto, Jack Dorsey's company, that allows people to work on V2 if they're interested. All they need to do is go over to Square Crypto's grant page and put together a proposal. And if it's approved by the Square Crypto team, then they get a bunch of money to work on V2 and help develop it with us. So I guess the kind of overall update on V2 is that most of the features and security efficiency are implemented and running now in some form. And then the decentralized aspect of job negotiation, which is probably the feature that is the most talked about and quote unquote most controversial for some reason. That is what's going to be primarily developed through our own efforts, which is currently underway, and with the help of the grants. It's an open source project for anyone interested or wanting to implement it in their system or pool. And then what was your last question you had?
That was it. I think that was just Stratum V2 update. But to dive deeper to what you just said, like, yeah, let's go over the controversy of, so people, and Jan and Pavel and I talked about this the first time they were on, but when they were still thinking of Stratum V2, we were talking about it in the context of Better Hash. And this is when they presented that, like, hey, we're actually working on something else that we think is better because Better Hash has a flaw, or a perceived flaw, that individual miners constructing the block within the pool will not fine tune for the highest amount of potential fees that could be accumulated in a block. And that is, people are still even knocking Stratum V2 for that as well. Like, how can you guarantee that happens? And the other miners contributing to this Stratum V2 pool will be making less profit than they potentially could, especially as it pertains to getting the most fees per block.
Yeah. So you're asking specifically about the block templates, and basically...
Yes.
Okay. So I understand some people's concern about maybe, it's not going to be the absolute most profitable block if the most profitable transactions aren't included in the block. I don't see this being a real issue, though, and in part, one, when you consider the rewards spread out across all the miners on a pool, if something were to be, a couple bips or even 1% to 2% less profitable from the block as a whole, after that's spread out to all the miners on that specific block, it would take a long, long time to start noticing any drop in revenue as a result of that. Also, for the most part, because miners are still incentivized to do so, they will pick the transactions and fine-tune the block templates to choose the transactions that would show them or give them the most rewards. And then thirdly, I think people are unfortunately underestimating the future of mining in places like North America and Europe, and their incentive and legal obligation to exclude certain transactions, whether they come from, North Korea, Iran, something like that. Whether or not that's actually possible and sustainable in the long term is another question, and people may be incentivized to include the most profitable block templates anyways, just because they would be at a disadvantage to the people that did choose to do so versus if they chose not to over a longer period of time. It's hard to see, to your previous point that you've brought up about like a KYC AML pool, it's hard to see a pool like that really seem attractive and competitive to anyone besides very specific institutions that would be hyper concerned over things like that, like how they're pooling their hash rate with other people. But that's not even necessarily a huge issue, I think, because especially on PPS models, and the pool in effect is a buyer of the hash rate, and so they buy hash rate from a bunch of people and mine the blocks. They collect, right, basically 100% of the reward, but then redistribute it to the people they're buying it off of minus whatever fee they're charging them. And then the PPLNS and scoring model, the hash rate and work is pooled together completely anonymously, and there's no way really to trace where the origin of it is from. And it's not really the miner interacting, say, with a miner in North Korea, but rather once the work's mixed up on the servers, it's not really like you're doing business with an entity like that or facilitating any transaction for them. So it's not really clear how it's going to play out. But I can see just mounting concerns over regulators and how they're going to interact with it. But in terms of V2, what you originally asked me about, I don't really see any huge valid criticisms out there besides the fact that, maybe someone would choose a block template that wasn't as profitable if they mined the block. I don't see that as a huge concern or a big downside moving forward.
Interesting. Yeah, because right, that slick SLIC or whatever.
Oh God,
that weak attempt to try to force a coalition of miners to force KYC AML on their customers, even though it was a weak attempt, it did sort of illuminate some of the potential vectors that these types will attempt to attack. And they would depend on a centralized entity in Slush KYCing all of the miners within their pool, but that's if they're constructing the template themselves. They're actually adding the block and then distributing the reward centrally. Most importantly, the distribution of the reward. You could argue that's money transmission service or whatever they call it. I don't even fucking know. But Jeremy Rubin presented an interesting idea that would need opt check template verify to being able to make it happen. The idea of a decentralized mining pool where you have a bunch of individual miners pointing hash rate, this decentralized pool, each is constructing the block template, the one that mines the block then distributes it to the other miners in that decentralized pool, but each miner in that pool could mine a block and then they each have to distribute it individually to the other miners in the decentralized pool. And that a situation like that makes KYC AML almost too burdensome. Like we have each individual having to KYC each other individual in a decentralized pool. It just seems logistically impossible. So getting to that point seems like something that should be a goal for mining pools or just miners in general.
I haven't heard too much about that, and I honestly I don't know much about that specific project you mentioned at all, but a couple things jumped to my mind. One, every time someone tries to attempt a pool that say is decentralized, or maybe the pool never for even a second acts as a custodian, it just goes straight from the Coinbase into the miner's wallet, you immediately run into scalability issues. It's not really easy to facilitate this when you're talking about any serious volume of hash rate. I think, if you're just talking about a couple hundred petahash, it could be fine. But as you scale up into the exahash territory, it's not feasible based on my conversations with some of the people at Slush Pool. And then also, as mining gets more and more consolidated into these larger entities after each halving, it would seem easier at that point if a pool like you just described popped up for the regulators in each country to go to the people they know who are mining and double checking where they're sending their hash rate. So I'm not sure, it seems valid for a world where retail is still very prominent in mining, and they'd be able to take advantage of that, smaller operations. But the further and further the network ages, the more and more economies of scale are rewarded in mining. So it may be much easier in the future to sort of monitor where it's going.
Yeah. Yeah, I just dumped that link from Jeremy in your Telegram chat. I'd be interested to see
Lovely.
your thoughts on that after that. But you mentioned PPS too. It's actually a subject I want to touch on, pay per share. There's somebody might mentions complaining about pay per share, like if you are directing hash at Slush for X amount of time, and then your miners go down for some reason, and then Slush mines a block while your miners are down. You probably miss out on that part of the reward, but you guys are taking on risk as well. So I think explaining PPS, how it works, why you guys decided to do the payouts in that fashion would be educational for the freaks out there.
Yeah, so we actually don't do PPS. We do our own scoring mechanism. PPS is paid per share. But what you described is a possibility in our system, but it's very one-sided perspective of looking at it, because the opposite could just as well as happen, where you only turn on your miners for 20 to 30 minutes and then we mine a block, which is equally likely to happen. And if your scoring hash rate is been turned on, or rather scaling up for 30 minutes after your real hash rate is flipped on, then you're already pretty much at the average max scoring hash rate you're going to get, and you're going to receive a much larger portion of the block than you maybe should have, because you've only been contributing work to the pool for 20 to 30 minutes before the block was found, whereas maybe someone with less hash rate, or maybe almost the same amount of hash rate, has been doing it and still gets a similar reward to you. So I think it's kind of naturally people, especially miners, want to take the perspective that they see as them potentially losing money, but it could be equally beneficial to them in the opposite direction, which is never really addressed, right? Like everyone's really quiet and super happy when we're running at like 120% luck, but we never hear any complaints about that. But the moment we dip under 100, it's like, oh, what's happening?
Right.
So, when you look at it on a longer time frame, there's no issue. The payouts are still the same as a PPS pool. If it's just a question of whether you're willing to take on short-term variance for lower fees. And there's also the fact now that if you use our firmware in conjunction with it, the infrastructure is literally provided to you at zero cost to you. So it's basically a question of how much short-term variance you're willing to take on, and how important that is to your operations. Like some people may need extremely stable cash flow on the short term for various reasons, whether it be reporting to a specific board that wants to see that, or to maybe cloud mine, right? Because if you buy like a month contract, it could affect the results at the end of the month. It could affect it really well because you've bought a contract for a month and we get 110% luck that month, and you get way more than you expected. But it could equally go the other way down to like 95%, and then you get 5% less than you expected. But yeah, I mean, that's like all the formulas, how it's paid out, how it's measured and processed. It's all on our website. It's all public information. We publish the hash rate proofs as well, so you don't have to trust us, but can verify yourself that you're getting the rewards you're supposed to be getting. It's just really a matter of preference. Do you want to pay less and take on some short-term variance, or do you want to pay more and not experience that variance but receive lower income in the long term?
Yeah, no, I confused the feedback there. He was comparing Slush to a PPS pool. But yeah, no, thank you for that explanation. I guess that leads me to another question. Just I got my Slush dashboard up right now, looking at the amount of scoring hash rate the pool has. Like, is there a minimum threshold that you guys look for? You try to like hold the line at to make sure that you're mining enough blocks to keep your customers happy?
Just as much as possible, really. Um, there's no real line that like a hard line that we discuss that we can't drop below. But it's always just pretty much get as much hash rate as possible. Thus, the miner experiences less variance and our revenue increases from the pool. And that's something that's basically always happening in the background. So
Yeah. And do you have things like NiceHash that do profit switching, and you see them adding a bunch of hash rate and falling off? Does that
we do
annoy you
not
at all?
do profit switching.
No, I know you don't do it, but like other like things like NiceHash that do, it may decide to mine Bitcoin and point their hash at Slush or something.
Oh,
like
okay.
that.
So you mean like other people using coin switchers, and when they
Yes.
BTC, they pointed at Slush Pool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean there are some cases that happened. I know before halving, there was sometimes for like a couple months our hash rate would fluctuate up and down on a regular basis, like 500 to 600 petahash, because there was a miner doing just that. They were like purchasing 500 to 600 petahash on NiceHash, and then trying to devise some formula to game the luck on the pool in an attempt to only mine as we had a more like increased chance of finding a block, and then not mine with us as they thought our chances of finding a block decreased. So, I mean, it was interesting, good for them for trying. I'm not sure how well it worked out for them. But yeah, that was definitely interesting. I remember reaching out to them going like, hey, we noticed some really like strange activity from your account. Is there anything we can help you with or any support we can provide? And they very happily just explained what they were doing and what they were trying to achieve. And yeah, I guess that's the main example that sticks out in my mind. But there are people that do it on a smaller scale as well.
Yeah. No, that would be interesting. Like, do you think that's a wise strategy at the end of the day at scale, trying to time?
No. Especially with that much hash rate.
Yeah.
It's it seems pretty intense to be doing it with like 500 to 600 petahash, but it may be a fun experiment or just like a game to play if you want to, throw 500 terahash at it or something, and you have a much larger operation and you're just doing it as a hobby. But I don't recommend people do that at all. It's especially with some of the products that are available on the market now. It seems much better just to mine Bitcoin, know within a small range what you expect to get paid out on it. And I mean, personally, you have to look at the asset as well, right? Like when I look at Bitcoin, that would be the only thing I'd want to mine. I know there's profit switching algorithms out there that allow you to get more Bitcoin, but then it comes from an exchange. It doesn't come from the Coinbase, which has some implications as well. And if you're talking about longing Bitcoin, which is kind of what miners do naturally, I wouldn't really want to long another asset, especially when you have to put, in many cases, just millions and millions and millions of dollars into these operations. I would not feel comfortable, naturally longing any asset besides Bitcoin.
And mechanically, like, what's the process of moving that hash rate? Like, how much time does it take? And like, is it like a burdensome process?
From what I understand, no. Especially with V2, zero-time backend switching. It lets you install failover pools in case the pool you're connected to server goes down. It automatically just switches to the backup pool. But it doesn't seem like it's that arduous or burdensome for people to do it. Maybe if an individual miner were to try and develop an algorithm like that for themselves to use. But if you go to one of the many services out there that have profit switchers, whether it be a pool, whether it be purely a profit switching service, or any other person that's developed it, it's pretty hands-off from the miner's perspective.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
The tough part is timing the cells, right? Because you're switching between generally BTC, BCH, and BSV, which is only one component. The other component is after you've mined, each of the specific asset is quickly selling it on the exchange to convert it to BTC, which makes it a bit more complicated when you start thinking about liquidity and which exchange you use and how quickly you can sell it, things like that.
Slippage comes into play, I would imagine. It seems like a headache. Another question I have is, So when you guys mine a block, distribute the reward. You're not getting an award, you're getting a reward. How do you guys take into consideration the current congestion on chain, distributing actual rewards to individual miners, like taking the fee market into consideration?
Can you repeat the question?
So when you mine a block, when a miner within Slush Pool gets a block, and
Yeah.
you have to distribute that reward, is it automatically, like, is that Coinbase automatically set up, or do you have an additional batch transaction that sends the reward out to the individuals within the pool?
Oh, okay. So you're asking if it ever gets into like a Slush Pool wallet before it goes to the miners?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, it does. As I mentioned before, it's almost impossible to operate a pool at any real scale, currently anyways, and distribute it directly from the Coinbase into the miner's wallet. But depending on what you're reading, what circle you're in, there's like quote unquote virgin coins, which there are a lot of challenges to just philosophically, because then you're challenging like the fungibility of Bitcoin. But and then there's what people call clean coins, or you can equate the two, which is there's only one hop from the Coinbase, or rather two hops, I should say, from the Coinbase to the pool provider to the miner itself. And generally, the coins that go from the Coinbase to the pool provider directly to the miner are seen as quote unquote like the freshly minted or clean coins. Whether you subscribe to that or not is another question, but people that are concerned with regulation and compliance definitely subscribe to it. And then especially when you know the pool's wallet, you can easily demonstrate that it just went from Coinbase to wallet to yours. And so there's no risk of having it mixed in a batch, or maybe the coins coming from North Korea or something like that, as I said before.
Yeah. Yeah, the quote unquote virgin coins are Sharia compliant, aren't they? Isn't that
Yeah, I remember when I first read that some years ago when I was working in Beijing, and not Sharia, but halal.
halal?
When
They're not haram.
imams declared that Bitcoin was halal, and so that it could be safely used by Islamic institutions. I just thought that was so fascinating that here we have this brand new digital currency, or digital gold, however you want to look at it, that's sort of growing pretty quickly, especially the mining sector. And then you have this, almost 2,000-year-old institution or 1,500-year-old institution declaring it halal under like religious scripture and saying it's like God sanctions its use and things like that. It's just so interesting, the crazy world we live in.
Right. Do you subscribe? I don't subscribe to the virgin coins. They're all tainted with fees, right?
I don't really subscribe to it personally. I only subscribe to it insofar as the people willing to pay a premium for them. If it's real to them, that's good for me. But personally, I don't subscribe to, the whole virgin versus non-virgin coin thing.
Yeah. All Bitcoins should be fungible.
Yeah.
How big is that premium? Are those people willing to pay?
It completely depends. We always get requests on most of them just go completely ignored because they just seem so shady. Like the other day, I was getting an email. It's like, hey, these investors are looking to buy some coins from miners. They want 5,000 BTC over the course of 2 weeks. I'm like, okay, yeah, because someone that's looking to purchase 5,000 BTC over the course of 2 weeks directly from miners anonymously, they're probably real good people to do business with and put ourselves at risk like that, So most of it just goes ignored and I roll my eyes. But when you look at some of the more serious people, they're like, hey, we're this trading firm out of Lucerne, Switzerland or something, and they identify themselves and all that. The premiums are generally like a couple percent. It's nothing insane, right? A lot of people that don't know too much about it or don't have too much experience are like, oh, you can get 8% premiums on virgin coins, which is just not the case at all. If you can get any premium at all, it's probably closer to like 1 to 3%. 3% is rare.
You're probably getting a better premium trading P2P, OTC, like behind the scenes. Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. There's so many fascinating topics you can discuss in Bitcoin. Like, we're only talking about mining pools right now. Like, what else outside of your job and what you do excites you about Bitcoin?
Well, just one last thing on the version coin thing. Like, we see more and more hash rate instruments coming out, and when you can just buy physically delivered hash rate, it kind of makes purchasing a virgin coin seem irrelevant to me, because if you can just get the hash rate physically delivered, you get those coins anyways, especially when you can buy them oftentimes at a discount to the BTC spot price. So why would you pay a premium for a virgin coin? So I don't see them being even like a real concept that people pursue in the future. I see it as will just be people pursuing hash rate instead of these so-called clean coins. But outside of mining or inside mining?
But well, now you just brought up an interesting topic of hash rate futures and forwards contracts that I want to dive into. Like, that is like buying future hash, but engaging in a contract with a miner so that they deliver hashes that will be solved in the future, and the Bitcoin rewards that come with that hash to be delivered in the future. It's pretty revolutionary for the mining industry, correct?
Yeah, I think
evolutionary.
So. And I think Leo Zhang is shout out to Leo, your Alchemy of Hash Power stuff. So it's super interesting to read. He did a really good job at describing what you could potentially see in the future with some investors or even just data centers themselves, and how they would structure like a hash rate portfolio and how they would hedge some of their operational risk of running a Bitcoin mine, and how they can kind of offload some of that operational risk into financial risk for people taking on and bearing some of it, which is really interesting. And one of the ways they can sort of hedge, right, is to sign some contract in a forwards market with another individual that is interested in purchasing the hash rate. And this could be at a discount of some sort. I know that it's still very early, and rudimentary today, and that some of the discounts that buyers are asking for some of these products are just absolutely ridiculous. Like, personally, if I were a miner, I would never enter into any such contract, because some people are asking well below 90% of BTC spot price for some of these forwards contracts, and it'll take much more developed and liquid marketplaces before we start seeing a forwards contract start approaching much closer to the spot price of BTC.
It's the noon bell here. To let the city know it's noon. Thank you.
Thank you, City Council, for letting me know what time. It's so funny. It's like a New World cathedral bell, right? So I'm over here in Europe, right. I hear the bells ringing every hour everywhere, and over in Jersey, it's doo doo.
They're fainter, but there are church bells in the background going off right now as well.
Okay. It's reminding me of oh shit, I gotta get back to class in second grade when I hear that.
Right. That's for my niece and nephew. They know it as the lunch bell. Once that goes off, it's time for lunch.
But yeah, so I just see markets developing around hash rate and providing better hedges for miners. Because when you look at some of the larger miners or public companies that enter into some of these hedging instruments, they're kind of in a bind in many cases. So if they take on loans for equipment financing or something like that, then they're kind of restricted by these really aggressive interest rates on the loans. And then if they want to sell more shares, say as a public company, they then have to dilute the shares of their company, which isn't good either. And so with the development of something like I just described, you could really free yourself of some of those burdens and just enter into a trade with a party interested in buying the hash rate without exposing yourself to some loan that charges you 15% interest or
18 in some instances.
Yeah, exactly. Or I know what you're talking about. And or diluting the shares of your company, which is pretty destructive too. So there's every incentive in the world for miners to participate in something like that, especially some of these new hedging instruments as they become more liquid and more sophisticated. What I'm more interested in is the buy side. It seems that the market for the buy side is still pretty underdeveloped And I don't have any doubts that it exists and will continue to grow, but I'm really interested to see, who these buyers turn out to be, the biggest ones. Are they going to be, there's a bunch of noise around Paul Tudor Jones buying Bitcoin some months ago. Are we going to see people like him enter into hash rate contracts and get hash rate instead of Bitcoin as well? Is it going to be mainly restricted to miners and institutional investors that currently invest in mining already? Or are we going to see, people like Fidelity or these more legacy institutions start participating in mining by never actually purchasing a machine to begin with, but just starts purchasing hash rate as a part of their portfolio? I know Fidelity does mining currently, but there are plenty of, maybe something like MicroStrategy. Instead of just buying it on the spot market, you can buy some hash rate contracts and, stack up part of your reserve as a company in BTC over the course of a year through some hash rate you've purchased.
Yeah. No, Leo and I were actually talking about that. The slippage that came on MicroStrategy's buying strategy could have been alleviated with something like a hash rates forward or futures contract. And it's so fascinating how these contracts will work too, the mechanics of them, because it's just so much smoother than what you experience in the traditional financial system. So say you, as a miner, I engage in a forward contract with a family office. They give us a bunch of cash up front so that we can build out our operations and plug the machines in, deliver the hash. You could easily set it up with Slush Pool, say, hey, we're going to need a sub pool that directs the rewards towards these addresses that are owned by the family office that bought our hash months ago. It just seems like a very seamless process.
Yeah, that's a good point. But I mean, of course, there are risks to that too, right? If you buy all the BTC, OTC as MicroStrategy did, you may be exposed to some slippage in some cases, especially, or some of it is bought on exchanges. But then if there's any short-term price appreciation, you get to enjoy the benefits of that. Whereas if you enter into a 365-day contract for hash rate, and there's massive hash rate amounts coming online and difficulties shooting up, and there's also price appreciation, you could have potentially lost out. But another way to look at it is just a really solid DCA over a long period of time.
Yeah. No, and that's another big question that needs to be figured out. These contracts, and that's like both parties have to meet at the table and decide it. How much discount the miner is willing to sell that hash at, and the family office on the other end has to weigh the risk of more hash rate joining the network throughout the duration of the contract they've engaged in.
I'm excited to see it develop, though, because I think it'll make cloud mining largely irrelevant, and people can just engage in the exchange of hash rate without having to worry about some of these opaque deals and getting screwed over. And often in many cases.
Controversial topic, cloud mining. Some people think it's coming back with a vengeance. Others think it's still scammy. Are you in the latter camp?
I mean, it's not a. I don't think it's a scam. I just think it's. I think the purchaser of a cloud mining contract almost never comes out ahead. So not a scam, but maybe something that businesses willingly offer, knowing that their client will probably never receive as much benefit as just buying BTC, which you could question, of course, right? Like they're not doing anything illegal or something like that. In that case, right, if they're just operating a cloud mining platform legitimately. But I think that cloud mining only really gets going in pretty significant bull markets. So I think that'll be the case until kind of the things we talked about just now become a bit more developed and widespread. And then the benefits of doing, participating in that will become extremely clear very quickly to people that have traditionally bought cloud mining, especially when you see the profitability at the end of, say, like a month contract in comparison to one another. And that will force cloud mining contracts to sort of lower its pricing and thus margins to the point, and they may survive for a little bit after that. But I think eventually many of the people offering cloud mining, or many of the miners that have large data centers that offer cloud mining or hash rate contracts, will just eventually opt into something like a marketplace.
Yeah. Seems like a very annoying business to build too. A lot of moving parts.
The cloud mining?
Yeah.
I don't know. We've never
Yeah.
done any cloud mining operations, so I wouldn't know. But I imagine it's pretty crazy because it's mostly retail that's interested in it, right? It's not.
Yeah, exactly.
So
so you got like a customer service headache that seems like a task I would not want to take on personally.
People find my email and Telegram all the time. People with like, maybe 1 or 2 S9s. And they're like, hey, how can I partner with you? Or like, how can I get discounts on my like 45 terahash. I can't even imagine that happening at a massive scale.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, I'm gonna need you to 1000x your operation, and then we can talk.
Well, it's just right, like, bless them for doing their part, but I think so many people just don't realize what mining has sort of become at this point, and the scale it operates on, and people are ordering 2 months worth of the manufacturer's supply now, right? You look at the Horizon Kinetics core deal, and they bought almost 18,000 S19s. Which I think is like 1.42 exahash all at once, which is something that just didn't happen before.
Yeah, it's like a little less than a third of Slush Pool right now.
Yeah, it's pretty insane.
Yeah,
but we'll get them. Don't worry.
Well, yeah, I guess. So Slush is again been a stalwart in the mining industry. First pool still around. The pool industry has a lot of churn. How do you guys position yourselves to sort of stay away from that churn and keep the lights on? We've already talked about the different revenue streams you're creating, but just in terms of like the ruthless nature of the mining pool industry specifically, I think Slush actually, at least me personally, I love Slush because First Pool, it's always been I don't want to say altruistic, but true to Bitcoin's ethos. And I think you guys get, I don't want to say goodwill, but people want to point their hash at Slush because of the history of the stewardship that you guys have showed to the network. And so the question is, like, moving forward, like, do you see you guys, the percentage of overall hash rate rising because of a combination of people liking Slush because of the stewardship plus the benefits of the product suite that you offer?
I see it primarily developing through like the vertically integrated product suite that we offer. While there are some hardcore smaller miners that only mine with Slush Pool because it's the only Western pool, because we're the only ones that are transparent about everything, like publishing the hash rate proofs, keeping true to Bitcoin is the only SHA-256 coin we mine, from being the first pool, from voicing some of our founders voicing their opinions in the block size wars back in 2016, 2017, and offering open source projects and the amp lead and covert ASIC boost thing I mentioned before. So that does bear some goodwill, as anyone would expect it to. But it's interesting. It's kind of a meme as well when you look at some of the larger miners, especially when you look at some of the narratives coming out of places like North America, where they say, oh, we want to bring X percentage of the global network hash rate over to North America, which is a pretty lofty goal in many cases, especially when the figures are above 10% of the global network hash rate in a single facility. But then they direct that hash rate to a pool that isn't in North America, which means the terminus point for the hash rate actually isn't North America, regardless of the machines being there. And right, it's a nice story to tell investors and to shape your marketing narrative online. But in the end, as you said, it's a cutthroat business, and they're only going to go to the areas that offer the lowest fees. I know for a fact that every single large miner in North America that has a press release about this strong, North America vision, directs, a sizable portion, if not all of their hash rate to pools in China. So I don't take it too seriously.
Yeah. I'm trying to think if I can disclose. I don't think anybody would care. I mean, we point. I'm not going to disclose it, but it is. Well, and so do you think there will be competitive pools? No, we use Slush. I think we've said it publicly before. I'm thinking in my mind, but no, we do that because it's the best option at the point. There is no North American pool that's as profitable. You see that developing. Would you guys ever do another pool outside of Czech Republic? Or
I mean, we've definitely thought about that. Generally, it's not a problem for our North American miners, especially some of the ones that are, say, publicly traded, because of our transparency. Auditors from PwC, from EY, they actually all generally recommend that these companies use us because of our willingness to, open up and participate in something like a full audit. And this is very, very helpful for people whose companies are traded on a stock exchange. So that's something that we always have in our corner. So in that respect, we wouldn't necessarily see a need to open up something in North America, especially if we're already providing all the necessary information that we can to make it these companies, comfortably and securely keep mining with us. And none of this ever is disclosing private information of other miners, most of which we don't even have, right? Because you can sign up anonymously to the pool and start using it. It's only really for VIP clients that we speak to on a regular basis that we have any sort of information on, which is necessary, right? If they want special terms or conditions, or if they contact us looking to help them out in an audit they're undergoing, right? So there needs to be some exchange of information or communication on that front when it comes to that. But so I guess there's no real barrier for us to protect our users' privacy while allowing some of these companies with more restrictions to operate on us. So we can do that from Europe fairly easily. And, EU restrictions and compliance is no joke either. So we have our fair share of fun dealing with that. But I think the only way opening up a sort of another pool, or a proxy pool or an agent pool, as it's often called, in another area would be to take advantage of some local legislation or some tight-knit community that generally does something national within its borders. I know there's some countries where the government have legalized mining, and they're offering tax incentives for people that use services or companies within their own borders of upwards of 15%. So that creates some incentives. But then you have to evaluate, well, if we do set this up locally and have this team locally represent us, naturally we would have to give them a part of the proceeds, and would it even be worth the time and resources put into it? And at that point, it's still just using Slush Pool, because we'd be signing the blocks and the whole backend infrastructure would be us anyways. So why not just have a rep or two in that locale to push for use of Slush Pool? And especially with stuff like V2 and job negotiation, if that catches on, the need for a pool, a ton of pools spread out across the world, is diminished significantly. So,
yeah, that would be a great place to get to. Because that's what I talked about with Ethan Vera when he was on the podcast. The fact, you alluded to, people were oh, we're going to distribute hash, but a lot of the big pools, most of the hash rate, as dictated by pools, is still in China.
Oh yeah, I mean, good luck with that, right? When I always think it's kind of funny, it's kind of cute when these guys are we're trying to start a new pool, and we want you to help us do it because we have 50 petahash, and we're going to take the market by storm in North America because of all our connections. It's this is not going to be lucrative for you guys, right? The fee structures and the business is so competitive at this point that it just demonstrates that you don't really know what you're getting into if you're making statements like that.
Yeah, and that brings us back to the point made earlier, is will a North American mining pool be brought to fruition via a miner or something like an exchange like Coinbase? I hate to say it, but they're probably more incentivized to do something like that, then
Kind of worrying, considering the recent cozying up to regulatory bodies in the IRS in the United States.
can use a better example, like River.com, River Financial, or something like that.
Well, I mean, there's an opportunity. I think, like we discussed before, that some people that get into mining are going to be required or demand of themselves to enter into some sort of KYC AML pool. I don't know how much that demand is currently, and I think if those pools do show up soon, that they won't take off or gain any traction for quite some time. And the only way I see it making sense or being a viable move is if you have an extensive network of miners already and a massive amount of hash rate yourself, and you're not intending for the pool to be any real source of revenue stream or main line of profit for your business. And you're just solely setting it up to leverage other services or products that you want to offer the miners. Because in the end, all the newest pools set up are PPS pools, which require a large reserve to start up, right? Generally, you don't want to do anything less than 1,000 BTC in reserve. And there's a fairly large percentage chance that it could be depleted if you don't have the best luck within like a 365-day period, not talking about even operational costs at all. And then on top of that, you're entering into a market that, as we said, has already well into its race to the bottom in fees. So it's not like you're going to be able to convince some large miners to come on and pay a premium for the reduction in variance to them, but in fact that you're going to be stuck paying them what they can get on the market, which is extremely low right now. So your margins are going to be razor thin to begin with, and as soon as anyone sniffs out that you're doing this, they're going to be seeking out your customers.
Yeah. It's ruthless capitalism.
Yeah,
Bitcoin is bringing it to the world.
Good stuff.
It's beautiful to
it's
see.
Fun.
Right?
Never a boring day.
Never a boring day. So now we can finally get to outside of mining. Like, what is exciting you? Obviously, we talked about BitMEX before we hit record. Let's pour some out for BitMEX.
Yeah,
still,
exactly.
Still reeling. That's are the regulators trying to clamp down? Will Bitcoin survive into the future? Can it get over the hurdles put forth?
I've
Who
never
knows?
been concerned over Bitcoin's survivability. I'm super bullish long term on it. But I mean, kind of like what I mentioned before the podcast started, I don't think anyone is shocked that something like this happened. I think it was just a matter of when and which exchange, and I think it'll probably happen to more. But outside of mining, I like history. That's fun. As you probably could tell from the random 17th century spiel about a mint being developed in New England. Outside of mining, just reading, relaxing as much as possible, which isn't going so well. I did just get back from Portugal. That was fun. But right now, I got to be honest, my life is pretty consumed with Bitcoin and all things mining. It really kind of drags you into it in many respects. But I mean, the beer's good in Prague. I had my fair share of that.
Yeah, I was meaning like outside. I wasn't even meaning outside of Bitcoin, outside of mining, like within Bitcoin. Are you excited about like anything going on in Lightning, DLCs?
How sad is that? You're like, what do you like outside of Bitcoin? I'm like,
cheese. Free freaks.
No. All right.
Edward's a huge cheese enthusiast.
To all you freaks out there, as Marty calls you, cheese is the devil's food, and it should never be consumed. It's the most disgusting thing on the face of the planet, and it's probably the thing I miss most about living in China, is never having to say, please, no cheese on that.
I vehemently disagree. Cheese is a gift from God. A gift from the
nutritional
bacterial
value,
gods.
Awful for you. Tastes like garbage. Do I need to go on? It's stinky most of the time. Terrible.
Oh, I love that. I mean, how could you travel like Spain, Portugal, and not get some cheese with your jamon? Like,
just sipping on
seems
some
like blasphemy.
and seafood, man. It's the way to go. Some mussels, some lamb chops, shellfish.
Oh, Actually, I had paella for dinner last night. Lobster, clam, shrimp, delicious.
Damn.
Did you have any paella when you were in
I did
Portugal?
It's some crackling skin, like suckling pork.
Ooh,
Really nice with like some sweet potato puree and I've never drank so much wine in my life just because the beer is so garbage over there. I do not like it. Finishes like rubbing alcohol. Do not recommend Superbock or Portuguese beer. And in fact, the Portuguese do not recommend their own beer. So just try to stay away from it if you can.
do they not serve Imperial there either?
No, I just saw Superbock everywhere. I know they have they only really have two brands in Portugal, but I just saw Superbock pretty much everywhere I went. And coming from the Czech Republic, the beer mecca of the world, it was a real disturbing change of pace.
Yeah. So were you sipping on Riojas or mainly green wine?
So actually, the farm I grew up on in California is half of it got turned into a vineyard when I was about like 8 or 10 years old, and so I've been probably dipping into that juice a little bit earlier than I should have growing up. And it's the reds are always by far my favorite, like the really strong Pinots or Zinfandels. Cabernet is always really good, but a lot of fond memories from a kid stomping on the grapes and doing the little parties like that.
Yeah, the wife and I were thinking about a trip to Sonoma in January. We're a big fan of wine country, California wine country specifically.
You should check out San Luis Obispo. It's there's a ton of wine grapes there that have been planted in the last 10 to 15 years because of extra demand. And generally what they do is they start making all their own wine now. But before, when there have been dry seasons or droughts in Napa, there's still a ton of demand for their wine. So what they'll do is they'll go search throughout California's central coast to purchase the grapes. And then, of course, that drives up the grapes massively. You can charge like 2 to 3 times the price you normally would. So there's not a whole lot of central coast wines during those times. But in fact, the wines in Sonoma and Napa for like a good 5-year period were all coming from different parts of California because of some drought.
Interesting. I wonder if the fires this year will be affecting that market as well.
Oh, undoubtedly. It's been absolutely horrible. I've been monitoring that a little bit from across the pond, and it really kind of bummed me out when I saw that it was hitting some of the national parks, because I just remembered, those were our pretty much vacations exclusively growing up, was going to camp in Sequoia National Park or Gurley Creek or any of the other various, Big Sur, the beautiful redwoods of California and the Pacific Northwest. It's a shame that a lot of it burnt down. But the good news, right, the silver lining is that the largest of the sequoia trees are generally fire resistant, and a lot of them survived. So there still remain a lot of the 5 to 8,000 year old trees.
It's crazy. What's your solution for the forest fires? Everybody's throwing their hat in the ring. Is it land management? Is it controlled burns?
Controlled burns are always important. I mean, Native Americans were doing controlled burns for, thousands of years in North America to great effect. So I'd say controlled burns should always be present. And, just being extra cautious and taking extra steps as a Forest Service, as individual citizens, as cities to just be hyper aware during dry seasons and droughts has been the case recently, because no matter how much forage management and controlled burns you do, when you've had a dry couple years, the smallest thing can make it go up like a tinderbox.
The gender reveal party could fuck it all
Yeah,
up.
that's right. That caused one of the big fires. That's absolutely insane.
Right? Stop it with the gender reveal parties. Nobody gives a fuck. Please. As somebody's had a child and did not know the gender until my son entered this world, I highly recommend it. It's the best surprise you'll ever get. The gender reveal parties aren't worth it.
It seems always just I'll make a party out of anything, right? If you can commercialize it and make some money off of it, why not?
It's disgusting. Disgusting fiat culture. Like whoring out your kids before they even enter the world.
Yeah, you get a bunch of free stuff, right? Strollers, and there's at the baby showers, I'm not sure.
The baby.
Just don't have a kid, so I'm not too familiar with that.
The baby accessory market is the industry. It's not a market. It's a whole full-blown industry. People are making out like goddamn bandits. It's ridiculous.
I always hear people complaining about diaper prices. Are those as insane as I hear?
I believe so. My wife handles all that. I just check in with Amazon every once in a while, and yeah, it's a first world privilege right there. I don't even know. We have, I guess, there was an actress. I'm trying to think. She's in Saving Sarah Marshall.
Forgetting Sarah Marshall?
Forgetting Sarah Marshall, yes.
Saving Private Ryan and Forgetting Sarah Marshall come in for a crazy new Hollywood mix.
The collab you weren't expecting. Sarah Marshall goes to war. But the actress, I forget her name. She has like a diaper company, and they're like the cheapest on the market, and they're cool. She's apparently on a vendetta against Huggies to bring down the diaper empire.
Jeez, what an empire to take down.
Yeah. Huggies. Not for long. Not for much longer. Do you guys have like a bell that goes off every time you mine a block in the office?
That's a great idea, though, now that you've mentioned it. No, we don't. I'm sure a couple of the other offices in the building would get annoyed if we did. But yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
Oh, God. Just music starts playing, and we all have to get up and dance like the people at the ice cream shops.
Yes, turning Slush Pool into a Stone Cold ice cream place, whatever they're called, Stone Cold Parlor.
What about you? What's going on with GAM?
We're just trying to lock up gas deals.
Hell yeah.
Plug in as much machines as possible, as many machines as possible. Yeah, we're perfecting our container design. We just built... we just finished a couple containers this week, and they're the best we've built to date. And we're also working on some immersion. We want to get into West Texas to do that.
Cool.
You need successful immersion systems, so we're designing that out. And it's that again. Yeah, it's fun. Like, and I'm the idiot of the company who is just forward facing, and the ability to interact with our engineers. I feel incredibly fortunate. The stuff that they're working on feels very cutting edge, and they're some of the smartest people I've worked with ever in my life. And so just being able to learn from them. You have a chemical and mechanical engineer on staff, so just get into these deep conversations about physics and chemical engineering. It's like, well, because with what we're doing in the oil fields, we're dumping these containers off in very harsh environments, so you don't have to take into consideration the factors outside the container that affect the inside of it, which is airflow and wind, and dust particle and stuff like that.
We can totally sympathize with that, being some of the forward-facing guys and hearing some of the devs and engineers speaking at the company. It's just completely over my head half the time.
Yeah.
Like, what the hell is going on? Some of like the really nuanced, deep parts of the tech still just completely escape me. Some parts of the firmware, or some hardware plays we're doing, or some parts of V2, but it's just a constant learning process as you go along.
No, it is, and that's, again, I feel extremely fortunate to be a part of this journey with Great American Mining specifically. And yeah, so we've been doing like a weekly webinar catered towards oil and gas industry folks who want to learn more about Bitcoin and mining specifically, and that's just been a fun experience, seeing how people in the energy sector view Bitcoin and are beginning to become more curious about it. And it feels like synapses are beginning to fire in the oil and gas industry in regards to Bitcoin mining. So it's just exciting to see people having aha moments and being like, oh my God, this could be huge for us. So it's been fun.
Personally, I think it's the most interesting part of Bitcoin mining, the whole oil and gas sector. It's just like the benefits of it, how untapped it is, just the awesomeness of something like oil and gas meeting up with Bitcoin. it's remote. Some people having to get on like LTE SIM networks, satellite internet, and how much some of their operations need to be customized as a result of their environment they mine in. It's really interesting.
Yeah, we're paying attention to Starlink. Interested to see if Elon can deliver on that. That satellite internet, because honestly, if it does work the way they think it may be able to, it would definitely help us out in the middle of North Dakota, these far off places that aren't near cities with better internet connections.
What are you using for your internet currently?
We have satellite internet, but something like Starlink's successful to make it much better bandwidth.
Got to get BOS on your machines with a proxy. Reduce your data consumption like 40%. What are you doing, Marty?
Well, Edward, that's why we're having a call next week. When what's miner? We're just going to keep bothering you with that.
Yeah, it's we've had it exploited for a while, meaning like we're inside the machine. It's unlocked. We have root access, and it's pretty much mostly reverse engineered at this point. The last remaining task, which honestly, when we're not super close to the date it's released, I don't even ask the devs for a deadline anymore because it's so impossible to get an accurate estimate. But the last thing we're working on now is basically porting over boss miner support into the what's miner. And it's a lot smoother and quicker now with the ant miners, because once you do one, everything becomes much easier on the other models after that. There's a lot of similarities in some of the architecture. But with a completely new line of machines, it takes a little extra time. But I'm pretty sure it should be 2020 or potentially the beginning of 2021 when we start pumping out the M20S and M30S firmware.
I'm going to hold you to that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the best estimate I've heard, which means, who knows, anything could happen. Maybe it's a little sooner, maybe it's a little later than that. But don't include that part on the podcast. I don't want to be held accountable.
Well, Edward, if you listen to this podcast, I don't edit. I actually have to remind myself. I have to edit out a pee break in a podcast. I can't forget that. It'll just be 2 minutes of dead air. This is my editorial process right now. I was just reminding myself on the go, and so I'm definitely going to forget that you don't want that included in the episode. So tough luck. Yeah, man, it's been fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's been a fun conversation. I felt like I rambled a little bit there in some points, but I had a good time.
This podcast is just one large ramble, so
hopping between firmware, pools, V2,
cheese,
17th century New England. My brain gets a little scrambled. Probably messed something up in there.
I mess stuff up all the time, so not gonna hold it against you.
Beautiful.
But maybe your bosses will. Is there any parting notes? Any final thoughts you want to get out there before we wrap up here?
Let's see here. I guess just come check us out and what we're doing. Braiins, we got a mining pool called Slush Pool, as most of you probably know. We have pretty sweet firmware called Braiins OS Plus that makes your machines more profitable, and also gives you 0 pool fees if you use it in conjunction with us. We have some actually other exciting projects coming out in the near future that you should keep an eye on. And just interact with us whenever you see fit. If you have any questions, reach out. I'm available in the Twitter sphere and all that. But just to end, thanks again, Marty, and it was a real pleasure having the conversation with you.
The pleasure was all mine, Edward. And I really love your Twitter handle. You can follow Edward on Twitter at willhash4coins. So willhash4coins, the number 4. Very, very, very fitting considering your line of work.
Yeah, it didn't take long for me to think of that one. I was like, I know what I'm going to do. I didn't really use Twitter before I got into to mining. It's a new thing to me. But
it's a dirty place. It's a dirty place.
It is a really dirty place, isn't it?
your clean, pretty face should stay away from this whole environment. It's I get angry at myself for getting too drawn into Twitter.
Everyone's screaming at each other and memeing each other and shitting on each other.
Very few. Seems that very few people are happy on Twitter.
No. I doubt many are.
All right, I'm gonna go get angry on Twitter.
Go to the bathroom. Right now. So I've been drinking tea during this whole interview, and I haven't peed, so I'm about to burst.
Well, enjoy that relief.
I will.
Thank you for coming on, and yeah, keep crushing it, man. I'll definitely see you in the mining channels that we bump into each other at.
Hell yeah.
All right, that's all we got. Peace and love, freaks.